a little loose.
Yeah, one thing you know about a Reanimator Mirror, both decks are very low to the ground, they combo quickly, and they're disruptive, so you should expect sparks to fly on the first couple of turns as each player duresses, thought seizes, counter spells each other. There's a lot going on here.
So very important to look at the disruption. Chris VanMeter with 3 copies of Daze, 4 copies of Force Will, no discard spells in the main deck. Over on the other side of the table, 4 copies of Force of Will, 4 copies of Daze for Joe, but again, no discard spells.
Yeah. So game 1 will be discard free. We see Joe starting out on a fetch land here, Chris as well.
Joe also with 2 main deck copies of Firestorm.
Yeah, and the big thing that Lossett and Keter have brought to this Reanimator deck for this tournament, like I said before, is the full 4 copies of the legendary land Gemstone Caverns.
Well, the deck really doesn't care very much about card advantage because it's trying to kill on the second turn. You have Gristlebrand to recoup it if it gets into play, and it does open up a lot of the same explosive lines that Lotus Petal does.
A little bit of jockeying for position here. Chris VanMeter on a Ponder sees both Careful Study and Gristlebrand. A lot of great setup for him.
I believe Hapless Researcher as well, so if he didn't have a way to get it in the graveyard, he does now.
Yeah, well, there's some interesting things that go on in the Reanimator Mirror. Mainly the card Exhume can become a lot worse depending on what point of the game you're in.
Yep, you would prefer to go off through Reanimate. It's much careful. Even if your opponent has no graveyard, they can always Entomb in response. So you'd prefer to have Animate Dead or Reanimate be the ways you go off.
Now the Ponder from Chris will pass back to Joe. He'll get the turn 2 first. He has Chris tapped down on lands. Does he go for it? The answer is no. Second fetch land, no more plays, passes back.
And we have already settled into the late game, as there have been a full 2 turns on both sides of the table.
Absolutely. You see here with VanMeter, 2 Lotus Petals, a Careful Study, a Gristlebrand. If he has the Reanimate, then the whole package is there, and I believe he does.
Though, he could be concerned. What if Joe has Entomb, but no reanimation spell? If you can go off the Reanimate, that's much safer.
Yeah. Chris cracking the second fetch line. His reanimation spell is Reanimate itself here. So Chris does have the right target at the moment. But if he loses his reanimation spell to a counter war, things could get pretty rough for him. See Hapless Researcher, the play for VanMeter.
1 copy in the main deck. Most likely not a reanimation target with Entomb, but just another copy of Careful Study, which can also be exhumed in a pinch.
Yes, Researcher is sacrificed. Chris draws a Force of Will, which is a great card right here, discarding Gristlebrand, and we are off to the races. Reanimate, targeting Gristlebrand is the play for VanMeter. And Joe, who's just played fetch lands up to this point, we're going to see just what he's sitting on.
And Daze is not relevant interaction right now because Chris still has the Lotus Petal left over, ready to make mana. So it's just Force of Will here from Joe.
And maybe, yeah, Force of Will, possibly 2 Dazes if Joe has both of them, but that'd be a huge cost to fight over this one spell. And in response, Joe's actually going to Entomb. And we'll see, does Chris want to fight here? He has Force Will. I know I'm not positive he has a blue spell to go with it.
And this might be Joe kind of shucking and jiving here. The Entomb gives Chris some pause. Maybe he Force of Wills it out of fear of whatever is going on to follow up. And then if Joe has Force of Will in his hand, now he has a much better shot of countering the Reanimate.
Yeah, most likely in this matchup, you can't trade. It's oftentimes you can't trade large creatures. You know, you can't let one player. Joe can't let Chris reanimate a creature and then Joe reanimate one on his own turn. Chris can use the free card draws off something like Gristlebrand to really just win the counterspell over Joe's reanimate.
Yeah, I mean, it stands to reason the Reanimator Mirror, the first person that gets to reanimate has a huge edge.
And Tomb resolves, Joe bins a Gristlebrand, and no war is fought. Chris gets to have a Gristlebrand. He takes the damage off reanimate, but now he has the 7/7 in play. And that is great news for VanMeter. With Force of Will in hand, he can draw 7 cards. You see he's at 10. Remaining hand is Animate Dead, Lotus Petal, Force of Will. No card to go with it just yet.
But he's going to get, to put it mildly, a lot of looks at it.
Yeah, you see he draws 7 here. Chris goes down to 3. A lot of cards entering his hand. Another Gristlebrand, Tidespout Tyrant. 2 blue cards to pitch to Force of Will. I'm not positive, though, that he found any other disruption outside of that one Force of Will.
But still not bad insurance here because Joe did not counter back. You know, you figure if Joe had Force of Will, you would have fought over your reanimation spell. So you'd have to feel, if you're in Chris's spot, like your 1 Force of Will. No, it's not a lot of protection, but it's probably enough.
Yeah, all it takes is one hit from that Gristlebrand. And Chris does have a second Lotus Petal, so he has a lot of magic, a lot of mana, rather, to fight over a counter where that might happen. Still managing to keep Joe's possible days as really blank cards. And Chris moving to cleanup, deciding which 7 he wants to keep here. He just really needs to make it to the next turn and get that hit in with Gristlebrand.
Though I think Chris would be well served by discarding a creature here. It looks like he's keeping it all in his hand. Just because now with no creature, it opens up the door for Exhume. I guess the flip side of that is if he discards one of his creatures, it gives Joe a reanimate target. But he already has that in Gristlebrand. So unless Chris is especially worried about Tidespout Tyrant being the card that gets brought back, which perhaps he is, I would perhaps want a little more protection against a possible Exhume.
Well, I think if Chris discarded Tidespout Tyrant and Joe did land a reanimate on it, it's very possible that Joe would just bounce the Gristlebrand and be able to steal the game away from VanMeter.
It's problematic, but the flip side is now Exhume is, something Joe can do.
Yeah, certainly difficulties on both sides. Joe, on his turn, he's going to try for Animate Dead on Gristlebrand. You have to think that'll get a response from Chris, not wanting to have a Gristlebrand mirror here. He'd like to be the only player with Legendary Demon in play.
Yeah. If this is not counterspell worthy, I don't know what is. But I think Chris rather just waiting for Joe to present before he does anything.
And that will get the Force of Will from Chris's hand. He goes to 2. So those numbers not irrelevant here. Exiles the Tidespout Tyrant.
So if he's willing to exile the Tidespout Tyrant, I think that means that he just has no interest in getting fancy at all. He feels like Gristlebrand is good enough to win the game, and he doesn't want to risk putting anything in his graveyard.
Now, if Joe has mana and reanimate, he could go for it again, but he does not. He doesn't have either. So he'll pass back with 2 tap lands to Chris, and it looks like Chris is going to get a hit in with Gristlebrand, and that's going to happen. Chris goes up to 9, and that may be all he needs to seal this.
It all stands to reason. If Joe didn't have the Force of Will to fight over the reanimation spell last turn, he probably doesn't have Force of Will to push through a reanimation spell on his own turn. And now the coast is clear, I think, for Chris to go get Iona, reanimate it, and lock the game up.
Yeah, and you see him doing that. Casting his Entomb, putting Iona in the graveyard. He does have an Animate Dead in hand, and he's going to shut off all of Joe's answers here. Casting Animate Dead on Iona. Once she names black, Joe can't get any creatures out of his yard.
Nope. No show and tell, I believe, in Joe's list.
Not in the main.
He's only on black cards, and Chris locks it up.
And there you go. Game 1 going over to Chris VanMeter here in the final round of day 1. This is round 7 in the Players' Championship. These 2 players fighting for one of the last spots on day 2.
In a very chaotic, very fast mirror match.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Chris's sideboard here, 2 copies of Pithy Needle, an Inkwell Leviathan, a Sphinx of the Steel Wind, several copies of Abrupt Decay, a Flush Storm, a Duress, 2 copies of Massacre, 4 Thoughtseizes. Give me the discard spells here, the Duress, the 4 copies of Thoughtseize. I think Flush Storm can come in, and it would not surprise me if he brought in Inkwell Leviathan as a superior reanimation target versus Elish Storm, which doesn't do very much in the matchup.
Yeah. So a couple options for Chris here. We're going to take a look at Joe's options in just a second. One of the things, though, if you've been following on the internet, one of the really big sensations of the last year has been the webcomic Cardboard Crack. Cardboard Crack, the paperback books, the popular webcomic in now 3 different volumes. You can get them all. They're on sale for $12.99 each. You can find out more about them at starcitygames.com/cardboardcrack.
A lot of fun, whimsical, black and white comic strip. Good gift for your loved ones, good gift for yourself.
Yeah.
Who doesn't deserve to laugh,
Going to the sideboard, though. So Joe Lossett's board doesn't actually have the normal show and tell package that you might expect out of a Reanimator deck. So looking at things he has here, a lot of them, he has 3 Thoughtseize to fight in this matchup, and that's really going to help him a lot. Hand Disruption, really anything that's low to the ground, a 0 or 1 mana cost card, I think would help here. But outside of that, what options does he have?
Well, the Thoughtseizes are going to be great here. I think likely the Iona is a superior reanimation target than some of the other more fidgety stuff he has in his deck. 1 Coffin Purge is a great card, too. Coffin Purge is really nice in a Reanimator sideboard because if you happen to draw it, it can play over the top of a counterspell, and it is an Entomb target if your opponent tries to go off. So very flexible, and I think the 1 Coffin Purge comes in. Great to draw and great to tutor for.
So those are the options out of Joe's side. Now, Joe's going to get to be on the play here. So the 4 Gemstone Caverns he has in his deck, not going to be as helpful here.
No, but the issue is, what's the opportunity cost of having colorless lands? And in a matchup where your opponent doesn't have Wasteland, Joe can just fetch for Underground Sea. Yes, there's some spots where you want to chain together multiple 1-mana spells, and Gemstone Cavern is problematic in those games. But the Reanimator mana base is pretty stable, assuming it's not playing against Wasteland. It's not that color sensitive, so yes, it is a cost. Absolutely, they are just worse than other lands you could be playing while you're on the play, but the cost overall should be low.
Yeah, I would expect even post-board these games to go very quickly. Both players do get access to discards, so there's a little more jockeying and more information, but it's still going to be a fast game.
Yeah, I mean, this game is not going to go on for 8 turns. You know, the discard spells help. These players still have their counter spells. All that's good, but the game's still likely to be determined one side or the other within the first 3 turns.
Yeah, especially as we saw there. Joe not having the quick reanimation, and that's really what got him. Chris was able to make a Gristlebrand on turn 2. Joe wasn't able to win a fight over it, and after that it was pretty rudimentary for Chris to take the game home.
Given all the talk of Blue-Red Delver that we've had, so far at least, our Rounds of Legacy are very combo-oriented. A bunch of Reanimator lists, Logan Mize playing Omnitel, even Joe Lossett, the most faithful servant to miracles that I know of, mixing it up for this tournament.
Yeah, and a lot of players, like you said, choosing to play combo decks for this format. And I think some of that is really in response to these Delver decks getting really less disruptive and less honest with their disruption. Even Steven Mann, a player who has been a fan of Teamer Delver in the past, really played a blue-red style of Teamer Delver this weekend. Cut his Nimble Mongoose, decided to play Monastery Swiftspear, took out the Stifles, took out the Wastelands, kept in Tarmogoyf, so still has green cards, but you know, there's not as much disruption there for a lot of the combo decks.
Spell Pierce is not really good at fighting Treasure Cruise most of the time, nor is it a card you want to draw off of your Treasure Cruises. And something has to go from the deck. You got to make room. It's really hard to justify cutting the cantrips or the burn spells because you can always cast them. They're always productive. And that's what you want to be doing alongside Treasure Cruise. But it has made combo a more attractive option over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah, and it really is the style. The interesting part is the type of combo decks it has made viable. And it's been these semi-fast combo decks with disruptive elements. So things like Dredge, Storm, Reanimator. This is what we see the people playing.
I've seen a huge uptick in Reanimator and of Storm as well.
Yeah, last week's Invitational, Storm was among the top performing Legacy decks of the weekend.
Not surprised, you get very good game 1s now against the Delver decks, which used to be your most problematic matchup. And all the good matchups are still there.
We are underway for game 2 here. Reanimator Mirror, Lossett is on the play. And both players keeping on 7. No turn 1 from Joe, just a fetch land. And we'll go back over to VanMeter. Can steal the initiative with something like a Lotus Petal. And looks like he has a great hand here. 2 Reanimates and an Exhume. Lotus Petal, Careful Study. A lot of options for Chris. Doesn't have the creature just yet.
I think he wants to just keep his Brainstorm in hand here because, you know, his hand doesn't have all it needs just yet, and would like to protect himself from a discard spell or be able to find Force of Will in case Joe's opening is very explosive.
Joe, too, plays a second land and passes back. And you notice not too much early game action. A lot of the times, this is just a game of pulling the trigger. Both players will do nothing until one player decides to go for it. And players are maybe going to wait a little bit longer post-board because you have to respect their ability to interact with the graveyard. Game 1, you know there's nothing going on. The coast is clear. But sure.
Post-board, these players will often have ways to interact with the opponent's graveyard at instant speed.
Yeah, I mean, cards like Surgical Extraction could exist here. Now, we know neither player is playing it. Their main form of disruption are cards like Duress and Thoughtseize.
Coffin Purge, Extirpate. There's a lot of cards that are floating around here that both these players have to respect.
And land 2 from VanMeter. Now he'll play Careful Study. And draw 2. You see he has a Daze already in hand. May get rid of some of these extra Reanimate spells.
And Joe's mana base is really a consequence of Wasteland being on the decline, too. It would be very hard to rationalize 4 Gemstone Caverns and a red splash off of Badlands in a world where all the Delver decks were still packing 4 copies of Wasteland, but that's just not the case anymore.
Yeah.
These blue-red decks have moved completely away from it, and you can be greedier with your mana than you could have been 2 months ago.
Misty Rainforest and Reanimate, the discard for Chris, still hasn't found that creature he's looking for. You see, not too happy of a look on his face there. He knows that you can't sit on your hands forever in this game.
Nope. I mean, the Force of Will's nice. The days may or may not be nice, but I'm sure Chris would prefer to get something proactive going.
And we're back on Lossett. Remember the second elimination match Lossett has had today.
I'm in this kind of spot with Joe, where Joe is now, where you're mixing it up for a big tournament. You're known for playing a certain style of deck. You decide to do something different. And if you do well, it feels like an affirmation. And if you don't do what you wanted to do, you think to yourself, man, why did I mess up a good thing, you know?
Yeah. You have to wonder if he's second guessing. Earlier today, at the end of Standard, he had an elimination against Kevin Jones. Joe lost the first game there as well. So knows what it's like to be really under the gun in this fashion.
Oh, he's told me he's been on the edge of the seat the whole tournament. It's not been easy. He's had his back against the wall essentially the whole time.
It's a lot of rounds in a row to play like it's your last round. Eventually, it's got to be a relief once you finally hit day 2.
Might even be a relief if the tournament ends, to be honest.
Joe finds some disruption. Thought sees he's going to get to see what he's playing against. Chris does have a brainstorm in hand. We'll see if he fires it off. Does not. Wants to hang on. Doesn't want to crack the fetch land just yet. So we see Exhume, Reanimate, the 2 reanimation spells for Chris. Daze, Force of Will, 2 counter spells. And the remaining 2, Brainstorm and Lotus Petal.
The issue with brainstorming here is that Chris has to put the shields down this turn because he's, I would assume, doing that to hide his counter spells. This way, Joe can only take either the Force of Will or the Daze, and Chris can at least get out of this turn.
Yeah, and in a matchup this fast, you have to think about your cards, not how good are they in general, but how good are they right now, because you don't know if next turn exists.
Yep. You don't know if that Force of Will is going to even matter, you know?
I think that's it. All the cards have such a short lifespan.
You know, Chris next turn gets to untap, draw, brainstorm, and hopefully find a hand that he can win with.
So you think Lossett takes the brainstorm then? Yeah.
Yeah, if Joe can't do anything this turn, Chris has nothing in the graveyard, and now his hand is just, it's nothing. He's got no action.
And you see that from Joe. He's going to thought seize away the brainstorm, play a 3rd land, and just pass back the turn. Joe not making any aggressive moves either, but he is making cards like the Daze in Chris VanMeter's hand worse with every turn.
Not only that, he's stranded Chris with a hand with nowhere to go. I mean, there's nothing in the graveyard, no way to get something in the graveyard.
Chris has to draw an Entomb or something like that.
Yeah.
Chris draws a card. Now, he drew a land but opted not to play it in the situation that he draws a brainstorm. So we go back to Lossett on turn 4. He'll lead off with Ponder. Knows he has the advantage. He's trying to stretch it.
And I suppose I was wrong. I thought we were going to see a much more explosive opening, even with both players having more interaction, but it's gone on for a while. And neither player, even with something in their graveyard.
Yeah. To me, it seems like both players kept speculative hands, the kind that if you draw the right card are very fast. They have most of the tools there, and both of them really just missed on what they were looking for. VanMeter hand with a lot of reanimation, some counter magic, some card filtering, everything but the large creature. Couldn't find the creature to reanimate, and Lossett actually looks like maybe he had the exact same problem.
But Joe's hand at least is pretty disruptive.
Right. Ponder, he draws off it, and what a draw for VanMeter. That is the one he was looking for. We said he not only did he need a creature, but he needed a way to put it into his graveyard. Well, Entomb will do both of those for Chris.
And he gets to do it with Force of Will backup and the ability to pay for a Daze. That's a lot.
It's a lot. Now, Chris has a Daze and a Force of Will in his hand, but no 3rd blue card. So he can't force and Daze here, actually. He can only Force of Will.
But he can pay for an opposing Daze.
Correct. He can do that. And with the card like Lotus Petal in his hand, if he wants to, he can even get 2 lands going here to really help pay for a card like Daze.
Yeah, I mean, Joe, you just assume these Reanimator decks are flush with islands. He's actually only got 1 in play. So Chris has to concern himself only with the 1. And I think that might be enough of an incentive for Chris to go for it this turn.
Yeah, Joe can only Daze once here. And Chris will start. That's going to be Entomb. Is how a bunch of jockeying for position. Now one player decides to flip the switch. It's VanMeter again. Starts out with Entomb. Looks like he's gonna keep it simple. It's Griselbrand.
Can't go wrong with the classics.
Nope, he's the standby in the deck, and a lot of the time just the best target. Lotus Petal played. Chris being very careful to play around Daze here. Remember, Chris has not made a land drop just yet. He does have another land in his hand. He'll get a second Underground Sea. And is this going to work? He has a Force of Will. He can pay for Daze. It seems real good for Chris. It's going to be Reanimate targeting Griselbrand. And Joe is going to need 2 Force of Wills to win this counter war.
And Chris still with an Exhume, so even if he loses the counterspell battle here, he can just go for it again next turn.
And Joe is going to Coffin Purge the Griselbrand. This is the one-up from his sideboard. So, Coffin Purge, the pretty strong graveyard hate card here.
I mean, this is just perfect. You know, like I said, if he draws it, he can play over the top of a counterspell with it. And that's exactly the scenario that's gotten set up here.
Yeah, Coffin Purge so good in this matchup. Remember, it, like its reprint from Innistrad, can be flashed back from the graveyard, so you can actually entomb for this in the middle of a counter war.
And it's still floating in Joe's graveyard. I mean, it's not even like the damage is done at this point. Chris has got to work his way around this.
Yeah,
Card's still in the graveyard on top of whatever Joe has packed in his hand.
And that's why Chris couldn't fight a counter war on it. If Chris Force of Wills the Coffin Purge, Joe just uses it again out of the graveyard. It flashes back for a single black, which Joe has. And a huge turn of events to go in Joe's favor. This one out of his board, among the best cards he can have in the matchup.
Oh, it's got to be the best. I don't know if it's better or worse than Extra Pay to draw. It's probably comparable, but the fact that you can entomb for it definitely came ready.
Yeah,
and you know it's a 16-person tournament, and you got your buddy playing Reanimator at the least.
Well, that's the beauty of it, is because by just putting 1 copy of it in your sideboard, you actually get 5 copies of it in your deck because of how it interacts with Entomb. And now we'll see if Joe can make a move toward winning. He plays a 4th land, is going to crack a fetch. Remember, Chris, because he opted not to fight there, still does have a Force of Will plus blue card in his hand. But on Joe's side, it looks like he's going to be the one entombing now. And maybe the Griselbrand will be on his side of the board. We'll see.
But Chris is just in a ton of trouble now. Even if he gets out of this turn where it looks like Joe's going to try to pull the trigger on reanimating something, he's still got to beat the Coffin Purge that's hanging out in Joe's graveyard.
Yeah, Chris's hand doesn't have much action in it. It's missing some pieces. He doesn't have any card selection left, so he's just playing off the top of his deck. In addition to that, he does have to play around the Coffin Purge. It's generous to say that Chris probably would need 3 turns to set up for a win.
And it wouldn't surprise me here if Joe is going for Iona with the intent of setting Iona to blue and then saying to Chris, all right, you can't cast blue spells and you got to be a Coffin Purge too.
Yeah, I mean, blue or black both seem very good in the situation. It might be that he sets it to blue because he's not sure if Chris is boards into a show and tell package. He would certainly want to keep that from happening. And Joe will go for it. Animate Dead targeting Iona. That'll get the Force of Will out of Chris's hand. Can Joe force back? He can daze. He will. Chris has to burn the Lotus Petal. Chris pays. And Joe dazes again. That his fetch land for the turn meant he had a second island this turn. You can see Chris with a land in his hand right now. Maybe a bit of a misstep on his side.
And Joe still able to keep the Badlands up through all of this, meaning Coffin Purge still good to go.
Joe's opted to name black with Iona, so taking away Chris's ability to reanimate any creatures.
It feels like kind of hard to win one way or the other.
Yeah, I'm not sure which one. Yeah, they both seem great. Black gets around the possibility that Chris plays some sort of removal spell. As you see here, Chris just playing fetch lands. As Iona goes to work, she's a 6/7 due to Animate Dead. That'll be 3 hits. The first one sends Chris down to 11. The second one's going to send him down to 5. Chris draws Flusterstorm. That's not going to be any help. Force of Will, and we are on to game 3. Joe mounting a comeback in the elimination rounds yet again, dropping the first game. He took out Kevin Jones this way. Can he do it to Chris VanMeter?
That Coffin Purge was such a punch in the gut. I mean, I think that Chris there, if you ask him as he's trying to reanimate, do you think I'm actually going to get this thing into play? Given that Joe really hasn't done anything, sitting on a lot of cards in hand, I think Chris is probably thinking to himself, it's unlikely. Maybe it happens.
Yeah, I mean, it's maybe, right? He could pay for a daze and has a Force of Will, and Reanimator isn't that disruptive.
So not impossible. But the worst case scenario, right? All right, I fail, and then next turn I go for it again. So even if it doesn't happen this turn, spread over 2 turns, I got a pretty good chance. But Coffin Purge, about the worst card in all of Magic for Chris to see in that spot.
I mean, that's exactly it. If you're Chris, you might think, well, maybe he has 2 Force of Wills, but I get his whole hand then. I get 4 cards. I still have another I still have this Exhume. I can still go for this. This is fine. But you're right. Coffin Purge is a 1-card investment from Joe, and it's so hard for the Reanimator deck to play around.
Yep.
All right, so going to game 3, Chris knows that Joe has the silver bullet of Coffin Purge. So that he knows that Joe can Entomb for it or naturally draw it. How does this affect what Chris can play? How does this affect how he sideboards, if at all?
He has to speed up. That's the thing. The Coffin Purge, even though it's a seemingly innocuous thing, it means that Chris is going to struggle to win the game if it goes long because Joe's going to get more opportunities to draw it. He's going to have more opportunities to Entomb for it with mana available. So I think Chris just needs to throw caution to the wind because even though it's a small thing, I think it dramatically changes how the matchup plays.
Yeah, it does force Chris to be in, I guess you could say, the aggro role where these 2 combo decks are concerned.
To the extent that there's any role assessment in the matchup, I think Chris is the aggressor. Coffin Purge really shifts the matchup quite a bit.
It puts the late game certainly in Joe's hand.
And Chris has no analog. There's nothing in his sideboard as good as Coffin Purge.
There are some ways he can get around it. Chris can put multiple creatures in his graveyard and then Exhume. This is a way he can try to play around Coffin Purge. But the ways that you play around Coffin Purge, none of them are particularly easy for the Reanimator deck.
And as we mentioned before, Exhuming is fraught with peril too, because if Joe can put something into his graveyard, then whatever you get might not be better than whatever he gets.
Yeah. Ideally, I think Chris would, if he could play any version of Reanimator, if he had Show and Tells in his list, that would be his go-to strategy here. However, Show and Tell and Reanimator mirror is also not particular. It's also fraught with peril, as you mentioned.
Yeah, there's no good path. Show and Tell is going to be tough. And the graveyard's going to be harder too. It's just one of those spots where you're Chris, your opponent at least used 1 sideboard slot to dramatically change this matchup. It happened, and now I kind of have to cross my fingers and hope that card doesn't surface.
And it's really interesting, right? Because Joe Lossett and Kent Ketter came up with their lists together. So both of them know that they need a Coffin Purge in their sideboard because at least one player in the room is playing Reanimator. However, that player is their teammate. So it's always interesting, do you play the card? In this case, they both did, and they both got paid off because they're not the only ones on Reanimator this weekend.
I mean, it's not surprising the way that Legacy's kind of tilted. We're seeing more and more combo decks, and even if you're only metagaming for one another, and on top of that, a Coffin Purge can come in against a couple of opponents. You run into a random Loam deck, that Jeff Hoagland's in the room. Not unreasonable that you could square off against Jeff playing some sort of Seismic Assault Loam deck. And then the Coffin Purge is very good there, too.
Yeah, and if, lands, there's a lot of decks that you can do this against. And like I said, combo decks are on the rise again, and it's kind of the cyclical nature of Legacy here. As recent as Grand Prix New Jersey, we saw combo decks really just not performing well at all. The top 8 with 1 combo deck in it. And almost none of them at undefeated for the entire Grand Prix.
Well, the format has become less counterspell intensive at least game 1. And I think that Treasure Cruise has done some damage to Miracles, too. It's still a good performing deck, but the Delver matchup has gone from great to anywhere from acceptable to good.
It forced the Miracles players to start doing things like main decking Pyroblasts. They needed to have more ways to fight over the card Treasure Cruise because they really didn't want it to resolve on the side of the fair decks. And what that means is for combo decks, especially ones like Reanimator or Dredge that don't rely on blue spells resolving a lot of the time, I mean, they really can punish these fair decks that are trying to metagame each other.
Absolutely. The decks that have been kicked to the curb as a result of all of this are sort of the one-for-one decks. The Deathrite Shaman, Abrupt Decay, Liliana Skeleton, we see almost none of that anymore. Various punishing fire strategies, forget about it.
Shardless Sultai, one of the biggest losers off the Treasure Cruise era, for sure.
It's just hard to win by trading 1-for-1. The Sultai decks are spending a lot of mana for flexibility or for versatility or for power in their removal, and that's just not worth the effort now when the beatdown decks can easily draw 3 cards for 1 mana.
Definitely agree. We're going to move on to game 3 here in just a second. Chris VanMeter's back on the play. Remember, he was able to take down game 1. Lost game 2. Was never really able to find a creature in the early turns, and Joe had control over the late game. By that we mean he had control over turn 4. And it looks like a no-lander from Chris. He does have a Lotus Petal and perhaps a Careful Study. He's thinking about it. It has Reanimate, Careful Study, Gristlebrand, but no lands, just a Lotus Petal.
And Force of Will is protection. I mean, if he finds...
With a blue card. Yeah,
Force of Will. Finds a land.
It's Thoughtseize, Force of Will, Tidespout Tyrant, Careful Study, Reanimate, Gristlebrand, Lotus Petal.
This hand, to put it mildly, a low floor and a high ceiling.
There are not many 0 land hands you can keep, but that's one of the ones you have to think about.
It's close. It's real close.
I mean, so here's the thing, though, and why I like that Chris mulliganed it. If your opponent plays a Lotus Petal, cracks it, and says Careful Study, and you have a Force of Will in your hand, are you going for it?
Also, keep in mind, you've also sat there and thought about it for a minute.
Right.
So either this is some incredible bluff,
either you're Brad Nelson,
yeah, you're just some sort of bluffing master, or it's pretty obvious what's going on there. You've kept a no-lander. And at that point, I think Joe is going to be pretty aggressive about fighting over it.
Well, how big of a next level? Your opponent, imagine this, your opponent tanks for 30 seconds, says keep, plays Lotus Petal, cracks it for Careful Study, you Force of Will it, and they just play land and say go.
Well,
they're just brilliant.
But the Careful Study is going to be good even if it's not digging for the next land.
Sure. You still countered a good spell.
Exactly.
Joe Lossett also on a mulligan here, so it'll be a 6-on-6.
I mean, that's just, it's game 3. You're playing for your tournament. You could be out of here. If you win, it's 20K. And drawing up that kind of hand, I mean, that's a pressure spot.
If you miss the land on turn 1, your tournament went with it.
Yeah. Also, thousands and thousands of people watching the whole thing, so you look like a master or buffoon.
We'll see if they do better on 6 cards. Reanimator, once again, one of those decks that only needs to get a couple pieces put together. It can fire on all cylinders on as low as 5 cards.
Oh, this hand has the opposite problem.
Has 3 Lotus Petals, Brainstorm, Ponder, and a Fetch Land. Well, Ponder, Fetch Land, Brainstorm, and anything is pretty hard to ship.
Yep, it's just a lot of mana.
Yep.
And Chris is probably going to have to maneuver with these cantrips to try to shuffle away at least 1 copy of Lotus Petal.
Starts out by fetching on turn 1. We'll see whether he opts for Brainstorm or Ponder. Likely Ponder, but you're right, he has a lot of Lotus Petal.
Which could be good if his Ponder and Brainstorm really cooperates. This could lead to a very explosive opening. But if it doesn't, then he's going to have to find some way to get the mana out of his hand.
Yeah, if his Ponder finds the right couple cards, this could be a really great hand. He'll lead off on the Ponder. And we'll see what Chris can get here. Top 3 cards, he has an Exhume, a Brainstorm, and a Dig Through Time. Dig Through Time, actually a very interesting card to have when you have a handful of Lotus Petals. You can get one out pretty... It's not as bad as you'd think.
It's a plan B. I mean, this definitely sets the whole tone for how this is going to play out. He can just shuffle.
Right. He would have loved to have found a fetch land in here.
Or, as you mentioned, he can go with the Lotus Petal Dig Through Time route. It looks like Chris is just going to shuffle away.
Yeah, it does go for the shuffle here. Still has a second cantrip to try to smooth things out. That's the Brainstorm he has in hand.
Yeah, I think the Brainstorm gives him a strong incentive to be conservative there. Because if he goes for Dig Through Time and he misses or Joe counters it, his goose is cooked. I mean, there's just nothing in that hand, so.
Right. We'll see what his does have a random draw. We'll learn that one in a second.
I believe it was Gristlebrand.
Not a bad one. It's one of the pieces he needs. He needed a monster to reanimate. Now he has to discard it and reanimate it, so still some work to do.
It's a starting point of sorts, but Rome was not built in a day.
And we're over to Joe. Joe with a cop looks like has a pair of reanimates in hand, so he has that part of the puzzle figured out. He'll just play a land and say go. Back over to Chris. Too much of a good thing. Found Tidespout Tyrant that turn. Second Second creature, probably not what he was looking for. Chris will play a land, or play a Lotus Petal rather, give himself some days insurance, then cast his Brainstorm.
This is a hand that's at serious risk of being Brainstorm locked.
And the Brainstorm could not have turned out worse here for Chris. It looks like it's just a slew of discard spells that he drew into here.
I mean, he can Thoughtseize himself. Again, we're sort of slowly getting towards something.
If one of those correct cards is a Reanimate, that's not unreasonable that he would Thoughtseize himself.
But the problem is that, he's got 2 draw steps of, at the best, just keeping Joe off balance.
Yeah, it looks like his 3 cards drawn were 2 Thoughtseizes and a second Gristlebrand. And he went ahead and put both Gristlebrands on top. Chris playing a second Lotus Petal is going to crack a petal for a Thoughtseize here.
And this is the challenge if you're Joe. This means one of 2 things. Chris's hand is really powerful, and he's going to try to kill you this turn, or his hand is a mess, and he's trying to buy himself as much time as possible. So what hand do you put Chris on right now?
Cracking a Lotus Petal for the Thoughtseize? I would go with the latter there, because he had the option to play a land this turn and didn't.
That seems the most likely.
But you're right, it could still be the other. You can't, you have to still be worried as to what cards you're putting back here.
The most likely scenario is Chris's hand is really bad because he's kind of fumbled around early. He's shuffled with his Ponder.
Yeah, he mulliganed, shuffled with a Ponder. There's a lot to crack to petal to play Thoughtseize. There's a lot of indications that Chris is doing things in a fashion in an awkward fashion, I would think.
But there could also be, the 99th percentile of hands where he's trying to kill you this turn.
Lotus Petals lead to some of the best hands for the deck.
Yep.
Joe figuring out what he wants to hide with this Brainstorm. Knows that the Thoughtseize is going to resolve. If he suspects Chris has that slow hand, he can set up for a long game here. Brainstorm's finished resolving. He'll show his hand. It's a pair of Reanimates, a third Reanimate, and 3 lands. So Chris will get a Reanimate out of Joe's hand. And maybe Chris isn't the only player with a bust up here.
Yep. Although Joe at least with the option to shuffle if his hand's bad.
Yeah, he does have the uncracked fetch land. So if he finds his way toward a cantrip, he will get to shuffle.
But this is horrible news for Chris because I think he was hoping for, this is really bad for me, but at least the 2 Thoughtseizes will likely prevent Joe from doing much of anything. But Joe's hand's also mana heavy, and he's got a leftover Reanimate, even if you Thoughtseize again.
And Joe's draw for the turn was a Thoughtseize of his own, so he'll get to see what he's up against now. It's Thoughtseize back on Chris. Chris with Lotus Petal, Thoughtseize, Tidespout Tyrant.
And now the cat's out of the bag. Chris's Brainstorm locked with nothing of value coming.
Now, of note, Chris had a chance here. If he had played all his Lotus Petals out and actually had kept his hand to be those Gristlebrands he put on top of his deck, Joe would have had no choice here but to Thoughtseize a Gristlebrand. Which is a lot of levels of play there.
Right. The problem is if Joe has Reanimate, it doesn't matter whose graveyard it's coming out of.
Right. So in that sense, I guess you don't want it in the graveyard until you have the Reanimate spell.
Yeah.
And you see Joe knowing that he takes Tidespout Tyrant with the intention of reanimating Chris's creatures. That's exactly what's going to happen. And Chris shows, hey, my next 2 cards are Gristlebrands. I have no plays. And once again, Joe Lossett comes back from a game down to avoid elimination. And this time, that means Joe Lossett will be moving to day 2.
I'm sure that Joe would like to go get a bite to eat and go to sleep. This guy has played with his back to the wall all day long. He's got a lot in front of him tomorrow, but he has survived today.